In the storage rooms of the British Museum, on a shelf in the Kuyunjik collection that holds the supplementary material excavated from the library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, there is a clay tablet about the size of a paperback book. Catalog number K7752. It is one of several thousand tablets recovered from the library in the 1850s by Hormuzd Rassam's expedition. And it sits within a larger group of texts that scholars classify as literary supplements, auxiliary material that elaborates on, comments on, or extends the canonical literary works the Babylonian scribes preserved. K7752 elaborates on the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest substantial work of literature surviving from any civilization. Multiple copies of it exist in the British Museum and other collections, with the most complete standard Babylonian version recovered from the library at Nineveh. The story it tells is well known. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, after the death of his companion Enkidu, embarks on a long journey to find the secret of eternal life. He travels to the edge of the world, crosses the waters of death, and meets Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who has been granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim cannot give Gilgamesh what he seeks, but he tells him about a plant, a specific plant growing at the bottom of the cosmic freshwater abyss that has the property of restoring youth to anyone who eats it. Not immortality, not eternal life, the restoration of youth. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet, dives to the bottom of the APSU, and retrieves the plant. He intends to take it back to Uruk and test it on an elderly man. On the way home, he stops to bathe in a pool. A serpent emerges, takes the plant, eats it, and sheds its skin as it slides away. Gilgamesh weeps. The plant is gone. That is the canonical story. It is in every translation of the epic. What K7752 ADDS to the canonical story is the part that the standard version leaves out. K7752 names the plant. If you are following these, the artifacts, the records, the parts of the historical archive that the textbook version of human history does not address, hit subscribe. We post a new investigation every week. Now let me show you what the tablet actually says. The plant in the standard Babylonian version of the epic is referred to by a general descriptive phrase, Shamu Nikiti, sometimes translated as the plant of heartbeat or the plant of the pulse, and sometimes rendered as the plant of becoming young again. The phrase is functional rather than taxonomic. It describes what the plant does, not what it is. Generations of Assyriologists have noted that the epic does not provide enough information to identify the plant with any specific botanical species, and the standard interpretation has been that the plant is mythological rather than literal, a narrative device whose function is to illustrate Gilgamesh's near success and final failure, rather than to describe a real organism. K7752 is different. The tablet identifies itself as a commentary on Tablet 11 of the Epic, the Flood Tablet, the section in which Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about the plant. The scribe of K7752 writes that he is recording the older Sumerian name of the plant, as preserved by the wise of Eridu before the language of speaking changed. The name he gives is U-gibil-subba, literally the plant that throws off the burning, or the plant that casts out the fire. The phrase is unusual. It does not appear in any other surviving cuneiform text. The scribe explains in the next several lines that the burning being thrown off is the burning of age, the heat of the body that increases as years accumulate, the inflammation that consumes vitality over time. This framework is striking. Modern biology has, over the past several decades, identified inflammation as one of the principal mechanisms of biological aging. The concept of inflammaging, chronic low-grade inflammation that accumulates with age and contributes to the diseases of aging, is well established in the gerontology literature, and reducing systemic inflammation is one of the major targets of contemporary longevity intervention. The Sumerian framework of throwing off the burning is not just structurally similar to this concept. it is structurally identical. K7752 goes further. After naming the plant, the scribe gives its location. He says the plant grows in the place where the sweet water emerges from the bitter sea, the same general geographic descriptor that appears elsewhere in cuneiform texts, in reference to the area of the Persian Gulf where submarine freshwater springs bubble up through salt water, a real phenomenon associated with the Dilmun tradition. The scribe specifies that the plant requires this specific environment, fresh water emerging into salt water, and that it cannot grow elsewhere. He notes that in his own time, in approximately 1700 BCE, the plant was already rare. Most of the locations where it had once grown had been over-harvested or destroyed. He gives the names of 3 specific sites where, according to the tradition he is preserving, the plant could still be found in his lifetime. 2 of the 3 sites correspond to known geographic locations along the Bahraini and eastern Saudi coast. The third has not been firmly identified. For nearly 170 years, K.7752 has been catalogued as Gilgamesh Commentary, Botanical Theological Subject Matter, Partial. The standard interpretation, when scholars have addressed it at all, has been that the tablet preserves a Babylonian elaboration of the canonical narrative, the kind of supplementary tradition that scribal culture routinely produced around famous literary works, and that the name plant and the specified locations are theological elaboration rather than literal botanical reference. The interpretation has not been seriously revisited since it was first proposed in the 1920s by R. Campbell Thompson in his work on Babylonian medical and botanical texts. It has not been revisited in part because the question of whether the plant of youth is a real organism has been considered settled as mythology for nearly 2 centuries of modern Assyriology. It has also not been revisited because the modern science that would make it worth revisiting did not exist until very recently. Modern pharmacology has, however, identified a substantial number of plant compounds with documented anti-aging effects. Resveratrol from grapes and several other species activates sirtuins, a family of proteins involved in cellular maintenance, and has been the subject of extensive longevity research over the past 2 decades. The original sirtuin work, led by David Sinclair and others at Harvard, suggested that resveratrol could extend lifespan in yeast, worms, flies, and certain mouse strains. The mechanism is now reasonably well understood, though the translation to humans remains modest. Astragalus, a genus of legumes used in traditional Chinese medicine, contains compounds that have been shown to lengthen telomeres in laboratory studies, and the patented derivative TA65 has been marketed as a longevity supplement based on this property. Rhodiola rosea, an Arctic and alpine plant, has documented adaptogenic effects that include stress resistance and metabolic regulation. Centella asiatica, used in Ayurvedic medicine, has measurable effects on collagen synthesis and skin healing. Berberine, from several plant sources including the Chinese herb Coptis chinensis, has recently been characterized as a senolytic, selectively targeting senescent cells which accumulate with age and contribute to the diseases of aging. Pterostilbene, a methylated version of resveratrol found in blueberries, has bioavailability and stability advantages that have made it a candidate for clinical longevity intervention. Fisetin, a flavonoid found in strawberries and several other fruits, has emerged in the past several years as one of the most promising natural senolytic compounds, with clinical trials underway for age-related conditions. These are not folk medicine claims. They are peer-reviewed pharmacological findings, published in major journals with documented mechanisms of action. The plants in question are real. Their compounds are real. The anti-aging effects, in laboratory and increasingly in clinical settings, are real. Most of them are modest, far short of the dramatic restoration of youth that the Sumerian tradition describes, but they are non-zero, and they are increasing as the pharmacological mapping of plant-derived compounds continues. In 2025, the systematic screening of plant species for anti-aging activity is one of the most active areas of natural product pharmacology, and several research consortia have publicly stated that they expect significant new compounds to be identified across the next decade. What K.7752 raises is the question of whether the Mesopotamian tradition had identified a plant whose effects were more substantial than any of the ones modern pharmacology has so far characterized. The scribe describes a specific organism with a specific habitat, and he says it produces dramatic rejuvenation, not the modest improvements modern resveratrol or berberine produce, but the kind of full restoration that the Gilgamesh epic describes. Whether such a plant ever existed, whether it still exists, and whether the modern pharmacological catalog has missed it are questions the tablet does not answer. It simply records that the plant was identified, that it grew in a specific environment, and that by 1700 BCE, it was already gone. The corroborating thread, because the genre demands one. The Mesopotamian plant of youth tradition is not isolated. Ancient cultures across multiple continents preserve similar traditions, each centered on a specific botanical organism with documented rejuvenation properties. The Vedic tradition of India preserves the Soma plant, described in the Rig Veda as a divine plant whose juice, when consumed in ritual context, granted divine vitality and prolonged life. The botanical identity of Soma has been debated for over a century, with candidates including various ephedra species, the Amanita muscaria mushroom, the Paganum harmala plant, and several others. The candidates share certain features: psychoactive or stimulant properties, ritual use, and association with claims of enhanced vitality, but no single identification has been universally accepted. The Vedic Soma remains, in the scholarly literature, the most prominent unresolved botanical mystery of any ancient religious tradition. The Persian tradition of Haoma, the Zoroastrian counterpart to the Vedic Soma, preserves the same general framework. Haoma is described as a sacred plant whose juice grants vitality, healing, and a measure of immortality to those who consume it in ritual. The Avestan texts give somewhat more specific botanical detail than the Vedas, and several candidate identifications have been proposed. But again, no consensus has emerged. The Chinese tradition preserves the Lingjai mushroom, Ganoderma lucidum, as a real and identifiable organism with documented traditional use as a longevity tonic. Its identification has never been in question. It is a specific fungus that still grows in Eastern Asia and is widely cultivated. What is in question is whether its effects justify the traditional claims. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that Lingji contains compounds with immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory properties, but the effects fall short of the dramatic rejuvenation that Chinese tradition associates with the mushroom. The Egyptian tradition includes references to a plant called senef in the medical papyri, associated with the restoration of vitality and the prolongation of life. The specific identification of senef is contested. Several candidates have been proposed, including various Egyptian endemic species. The pattern of dramatic claims followed by modest pharmacological reality is consistent across the traditions. 5 ancient cultures on 4 continents preserve traditions of a specific plant with dramatic rejuvenation properties. The cross-cultural pattern is harder to dismiss than any individual instance. The reality of plant-derived compounds with documented anti-aging effects, modest but real and accumulating in the modern pharmacological literature, provides a plausible biochemical foundation for the traditions, even if the specific organisms the ancient texts named have not been definitively identified. This is where the suppression beat enters the story, because there is one. K7752 has been on restricted access at the British Museum since 2010. The reason given is the fragility of the clay surface, which the museum's conservation department classified as requiring stabilization. The stabilization work has not been publicly documented. 3 formal access requests to be submitted between 2013 and 2022 have been declined on the same grounds. The most recent request, submitted by a team interested in cross-referencing the tablet's botanical content with modern pharmacological databases, received a response indicating that the tablet's content was supplementary to the canonical Gilgamesh material, and that priority access was being reserved for researchers working on the canonical tradition. R. Campbell Thompson's original 1924 translation notes on K7752 are held in the museum's archive. The notes have been partially digitized. The pages dealing with the location of the plant, specifically the section in which the scribe names the 3 sites where the plant could be found, have not been digitized, and the museum's archive office has stated in response to inquiries that those pages are in conservation review. They have been in conservation review for 14 years. There is a separate strand. In 1953, a British botanical expedition to the Persian Gulf, led by a Royal Botanical Society researcher named Mary Hartley, surveyed endemic plant species along the Berberine and eastern Saudi coastline. Hartley's published report identified several previously uncatalogued species in marsh and tidal zones where freshwater seeps emerge into the Gulf. 2 of her field journals, which she deposited with the Society's archive on her return, contain references to a thorny succulent of unknown species recovered from a freshwater seep near Al-Kabar that displayed pharmacological properties of interest. Hartley's published report does not mention this specific plant. Her field journals were partially digitized in 2005. The pages dealing with the unidentified succulent are among the small number that were not included in the digitization. Hartley herself died in 1979. Her botanical samples from the 1953 expedition were donated to a herbarium in the south of England, which subsequently merged with a larger institution in the 1990s. The herbarium's records indicate that the 1953 samples were recatalogued during the merger. The unidentified succulent does not appear in the post-merger catalog. Where it went is not recorded in the publicly accessible documentation. Now, the modern stakes hook the genre demands, because the question that K7752 and the Hartley material raise is not just whether the ancient plant of youth tradition described a real organism. The question is whether that organism, or something descended from it, still grows in the environments the Sumerian scribe specified, and whether modern pharmacology has yet examined it. The Persian Gulf coastline has changed dramatically since the Bronze Age. Coastal development, oil infrastructure, dredging, and pollution have transformed the freshwater seep environments that the Sumerian text identified as the plant's habitat. Many of the original seep locations no longer exist in their original form. Some have been built over, others have been ecologically disrupted to the point where the original flora is unlikely to have survived. But not all of them. Several of the freshwater seeps in the area between Bahrain and the Saudi coast remain ecologically intact, and they continue to support endemic flora that has not been comprehensively characterized. Modern botanical surveys of the region are limited. The Persian Gulf is not a primary target for biodiversity research, and the endemic flora of its marshes and tidal seeps is one of the most poorly cataloged botanical zones on Earth. Several species have been described from the region in recent decades that were not previously known to science. Whether any of them correspond to the plant K7752 names is, on the evidence available, unknown. The systematic surveys that would settle the question have not been conducted. The funding for such surveys has not been allocated. The political and logistical complications of conducting botanical research in the Gulf region have, across the past several decades, exceeded the available institutional capacity. The freshwater seep environments themselves are extraordinarily rare. Submarine freshwater discharge into saltwater occurs in only a small number of locations worldwide, and the seeps along the Bahraini and eastern Saudi coast are among the most distinctive in the world. Marine biologists have documented endemic species in these environments that occur nowhere else: fish, mollusks, and several plant taxa that have evolved specifically to tolerate the unusual salinity gradient where the seeps emerge. The habitat is, ecologically speaking, an island system. Each seep is functionally isolated from the others, and the species that adapt to one seep may not occur in any other. The conditions favor endemism, and the survey gaps mean that endemic species may exist in these environments without any modern botanist having documented their existence. If the plant of youth, the U-gibil-subba, still grows somewhere in the marshes and tidal seeps of the Persian Gulf Coast, it has not been found by modern science. It may have been collected by Mary Hartley in 1953 and then misplaced during a herbarium merger 40 years later. It may grow in a seep that has not been visited by a botanist since the Bronze Age. It may be extinct. The evidence is consistent with all three possibilities, and the work that would distinguish between them has not been done. The genre's required concession. K7752 is most plausibly read as a Babylonian literary supplement whose botanical claims are theological elaboration rather than literal botanical reference. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition routinely produced commentary material that elaborated on canonical narratives with imaginative detail, and the specific naming of plants, locations, and properties in this kind of supplementary text does not necessarily correspond to real organisms. The cross-cultural parallels, Soma, Hauma, Lingzi, Senef, are real but explainable through the universal human tendency to identify particular plants with magical properties. A tendency that has produced countless traditional medical claims, most of which do not survive modern pharmacological scrutiny. The modern anti-aging plant compounds are real but modest in their effects, falling well short of the dramatic rejuvenation that the Gilgamesh epic and K7752 describe. The Mary Hartley material is intriguing but not conclusive. Botanical field journals routinely contain references to unidentified species that turn out, on examination, to be variants of known species rather than novel discoveries. The access restrictions on K7752 are most plausibly explained by ordinary conservation concerns. This is the responsible position. It is probably correct. What is harder to dismiss is the convergence. A Sumerian tablet that names a specific plant with anti-inflammatory properties, in a tradition where the link between inflammation and aging is described in language structurally identical to modern inflammaging research. A specific habitat, freshwater seeps emerging into salt water, that is real, identifiable, and ecologically rare. A modern pharmacological catalog that has, with each decade, identified more plant-derived compounds with documented anti-aging effects. A 1953 botanical expedition that recovered an unidentified species from precisely the kind of habitat the Sumerian text specified, with field notes referring to pharmacological properties of interest. A subsequent loss of the specimen during institutional transfer. Each individual element has an alternative explanation. The pattern is harder. The tablet sits in London. Hartley's missing pages are still missing. The Persian Gulf seeps continue to support endemic flora that has not been fully cataloged. The modern longevity research continues to identify plant-derived compounds with measurable anti-aging effects. The plant that the Sumerian scribe named, the U-gibil-subba, the plant that throws off the burning, has not been definitively identified, has not been definitively ruled out, and grows, if it still grows, in environments that have not been systematically surveyed in over half a century. There is one final detail. K7752 ends with a phrase that has been translated 3 different ways by the researchers who have addressed it. The most cautious rendering is, and the plant remains where the sweet water meets the bitter sea. The middle rendering is, and the plant grows still in the place that has not been disturbed. The third rendering, proposed by an independent researcher in 2016 and dismissed by mainstream commentators as overinterpretation, is, and the plant waits in the place that the bones of the cities have not yet covered. The grammar admits all 3. The cuneiform damage on the relevant section of the tablet is partial, and the final signs are partially obscured. What is clear from the surviving signs is that the scribe was specifying that the plant had not been entirely lost, that some location, somewhere along the Gulf coastline, still held it at the time of his composition. Whether that location still exists, whether the plant still grows there, and whether modern botany would recognize it if encountered, are open questions that the tablet does not answer. The scribe wrote down the name, he gave the habitat, he named the locations he knew. He left the question open. The plant, in his framework, was not gone. It was rare, it was hidden, it was nearly lost, but it had not yet passed out of the world. Whether that remains true 4,000 years later depends on what is still alive in the freshwater seeps of the Persian Gulf Coast. And the answer to that question is something nobody has yet looked for. If you want more of these, the artifacts, the lost herbarium samples, the botanical expeditions whose field notes go missing, subscribe. Next week, we look at Mary Hartley's complete 1953 expedition records and what other species she identified along the coast that have since vanished from the catalogs. The video on screen breaks down a related case from the same library. Click it.